Welcome, everybody, to CRE Fast 5 Secret Sauce, the show where we hear real-time insights from industry leaders. I'm Karly Iacono. Today, I am so pleased to be joined by Ellen Sinreich of the Sinreich Group. Ellen, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thank you, Karly. I'm terrific. How are you?
So glad you could join us. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. We have some really tangible, important content we're going to cover today on lease provisions and how landlords and property owners can get through a retail lease with more efficiency and less roadblocks. But before we jump into all of the sage advice I know you're going to impart on us, I would love to give our listeners a little bit of context of the Sinreich Group and how you came to be where you are today.
Thanks, Karly. So I founded the Sinreich Group about 10 years ago after a long career at a blue chip law firm and as general counsel for a private shopping center owner. I saw a need in the industry for attorneys that really focus on and specialize in commercial leasing. And as a result, I have been probably negotiating, I would say, hundreds, if not thousands of leases over the last decade, and have taken the legal leasing process apart and put it back together again in a more efficient and streamlined way.
I love this. And I can tell you when we have attorneys on one or the other side of a transaction or negotiation who are not specialized, who are not experts in real estate law, in leasing, whatever the project or the assignment is, it is brutal. So the fact that you saw this need to have a hyper specialized focus and become a true expert is so valuable to your clients, I'm sure. And gosh, I'd love to have someone like you helping for the negotiation. Makes all the sense.
You know, Karly, you mentioned, collaborating with your attorney. I find that when I work with brokers like you, the deals are so much smoother. Partnering with a terrific broker is heaven for me. So we are aligned.
All right. So we just have the whole circle of trust going here. Good foundation. Let's jump into some of today's content. So one thing we've chatted about in the past, I know everyone in the industry is feeling, is that deals and negotiations are just taking longer. Now, we blamed a lot of this on COVID, but we're 4 years past that plus. So what are some of the things that are coming up in your lease negotiations, which is today's focus, that are slowing down the negotiations? Give me some examples and maybe a few ways to combat that.
Okay, so I hear that complaint a lot, and it's a complaint that I've heard for decades. The leasing transactions take too long, and people often add, and they cost too much. So I think we're facing that today in somewhat of a different way. A couple of things to do to combat that. One is I beg all my clients to modernize their form lease. Get rid of those dinosaur leases that include every landlord-tenant issue that you've ever faced from the beginning of time. Streamline your lease, make it shorter, and make it more even-handed. That will cut your negotiations down probably 30 to 60%, in my opinion. The next thing I encourage my clients to do is make sure your internal lines of communication are open, so that when the leasing team needs answers to questions that come up in the negotiation, they can get those answers in real time. You would not believe how often it takes sometimes 2 to 3 weeks to get an answer to a question about how things work, or to get decisions made by the decision maker who's not, an immediate member of the leasing team.
I got to jump in because you had some really good points there. On the first one, I've seen a lot of conversation about forms going the opposite way, especially post-COVID, right? Trying to oversolve for every problem that could come up, which of course is virtually impossible. But the leases to me feel like they're getting more complicated, right? More layered, where we try to just protect, which is of course important to a point, but it really does cause a stalemate in negotiation. So you're saying dial that back, put even-handed language in, and come to a meeting of the minds, and that is more important than trying to solve for every scenario, right? Kind of the opposite perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So I do want to make one other point. I think deals are taking longer now and seem more arduous because we're in a volatile business climate where, every day the other shoe could drop. You cannot predict what is going to happen. You can't predict interest rates. You can't predict what the lending community is going to be facing. You can't predict what the tenant's going to be facing or the landlord. So as a result, both parties need to be more resilient and adaptable. The old refrain of saying, oh, we never do that, we've never agreed to that, that just doesn't cut it anymore. I think you really have to be prepared to listen to reasonable requests and consider how you can accommodate them without compromising your own position. That just takes longer.
Right. I think adaptability should be the word for 2024, right?
I completely agree.
You're just going to have to figure it out. I think that's everyone's mantra: adapt and move forward. Let's go back to the beginning of a transaction, the LOI stage. What are some things that are left out of lease LOIs that you wish were in there to clarify the negotiation process?
I would say the number one item is the condition of the premises when the landlord delivers it to the tenant. Now, often you'll see as is, but as is could mean a lot of different things to different parties. For example, does as is mean the premises are in compliance with law? Does as is mean they're free of hazardous materials? The landlord would say, no, as is as is. You take it as it is. The tenant would say, well, I didn't intend to accept a premises with lots of violations, code violations, and, contaminated with asbestos and hazardous materials. So it would be wonderful if the parties could drill down on that. And even if it's not as is, there's some landlord's work to be done. Often that's not completely fleshed out. For example, if the landlord is responsible for HVAC, does that mean the HVAC unit or does that mean the entire HVAC system? So that's often somewhat unclear.
So a baseline of the conditions and then any additional work that the tenant's expecting. I mean, we see that, right, in the tenant landlord work order. But what an interesting point on defining as is. You're exactly right? Is this up to code? Is there any environmental contamination to deal with? What are you really getting with as is? So I haven't heard anyone talk about that. We seem to negotiate the tenant landlord work ad nauseum, right? Who's going to do exactly what and how much money and when and all that. Fine, good. But where are we starting from if we're saying as is, I think is really a very interesting point.
Now, on the other hand, Karly, if you want to get to the leasing process quickly, you simply can't, fully drill down on every one of these points. So one or both parties might think, you know what, let's agree to as is and duke it out during the lease negotiation rather than at the LOI stage. So it cuts both ways.
Right. Another thing that I think, we've chatted about in the past, and it is very important, is the difference between your tenant and your guarantor. So talk to me about how that, I guess sometimes confusion or misunderstanding about the difference between your tenant and guarantor comes up in your lease negotiations, and when and how should both parties be getting ahead of this?
So that's a critically important point and actually would be wonderful if that was specified in the LOI, but often the guarantor is not necessarily even mentioned by name. There will be a guarantor, and it's usually a principal or another owner of the company, somebody who has a significant interest and stake in the tenant entity, who will serve as the guarantor. And in some cases, that party has not even been identified by the tenant yet. So it is critical to know who your tenant will be. And if it's a large established company, what are you getting in the tenant? Are you getting a single purpose entity with no assets? Are you getting the entity that signs all the leases? What's their net worth? Are they a U.S. entity? Are they a foreign entity? And then with the guarantor, what are we talking about? I mean, I can relate one war story where We negotiated a restaurant lease with the founder and key operator of this restaurant. They had quite a number of locations, but we didn't realize that that operator was actually never be able to get a liquor license until, just about ready to sign. So it's really important to know who you're dealing with.
And sometimes you just brought up a good point. Sometimes your tenant and your guarantor are different, right? I think that's a common misconception from newer investors, that whoever the name is, if the tenant could just be Wendy's, that you're getting a Wendy's corporate guarantee. And that is usually not the case. So understanding what's behind the guarantee, and then are they the same entity, the tenant and the guarantor, or are they two completely unrelated parties? Very, very important distinction.
Very. Now, one more nuance. Usually they're not unrelated.
True. You're right. That was probably a stretch. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah.
Usually they're related, but not the same entity. Correct.
Right. No, I'm glad you brought that up. Mm-hmm. Now let's move on to third parties, because there's a lot of sort of analysis that has to be done. There's third-party reports that come in, environmental, obviously, title. There's a lot of things in a deal process. But in terms of the third parties relating to a leasing transaction, where do you see hangups, and what needs to be done in relation to third parties?
So you're right. I mean, third parties who prepare the testing, critically important. If they get backed up, if they're not responsive, that will absolutely hold up your transaction. But then there's also the issuer of the letter of credit. If you're getting your security deposit in the form of a letter of credit, a bank is issuing that. And a landlord, if they are really buttoned up, so to speak, they'll have specific parameters of what that letter of credit has to consist of, and just who the issuer can be. So if your issuer doesn't agree with the landlord on what should be contained in the letter of credit, what the provision should say, that negotiation could go on for months. I mean, I once represented a landlord, and the tenant's bank was a Korean bank with an office in New York City, but they were not as responsive to the landlord's requests and literally held up the deal for months.
Interesting. Okay, so letter of credit, who's signing it, and when it's being provided is a big thing to focus on in terms of third parties.
Especially with the banking crisis that we witnessed, within the past year. Landlords have gotten much stricter about who they will accept letters of credit from. The other third party that can often hold things up is the franchisor. So if you're entering into a lease with a franchisee, their franchisor will often want certain rights to step into the tenant's shoes if the tenant is in default under the franchise agreement, to if they have a lien on the fixtures, furniture, and equipment, they would want the right to exercise those lien rights and enter the premises and remove that property. And so the parameters of those rights, what they can and can't do, is a tri-party negotiation.
So that's something I don't deal with, right? Because our team sells investment properties. We typically don't get involved in leasing. So when do you involve the franchisor? When does their sort of outline of requirements and terms come into play in the negotiation?
Should be from day one. Usually the franchisor's requests and perhaps requirements, everybody already knows them in advance. I mean, typically they have numerous locations, so they've addressed this many times. So as the landlord's attorney, if the tenant isn't offering that up immediately, you should say, please send me your franchisor agreement or addendum. Let's look at it, let's review it. And if there are some things that need to be ironed out, let's get ahead of that so it's not slowing us down.
Do you ever get 20, 30 days in and then get the agreement and realize that things are all backwards? Have you had any war stories where it's not provided on the front end and then it's just presented completely different?
Yes, I have had situations where the tenant just didn't think of it, didn't have it, provides it later on in the deal, and then there's a hitch. And this is one of those things that it's not exactly an unexpected curveball, but if it happens at a time when you're in the red zone, you're so close but
Right.
yet so far. Then you have to just forge ahead. Total focus, pushing, keeping lines of communication open, making sure everyone's on the same page so you get it over the finish line, the least that is.
Right. And you have such a great depth of experience. What other curveballs have you seen? You have to have some really great war stories. Maybe you can't share them all now, but anything else in way of just curveballs or things that derail a deal that people should kind of keep on their radar?
Yes, so I have been and am, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because this lease should have been signed months ago, but I'm working on a lease, and we've encountered two curveballs, moments of truth, you might call it.
Okay.
Just at the point when the lease has been pretty much fully negotiated, and that's taken 8 months.
Oh my God.
One of them is that the tenant's right to operate the premises for this use derives from its ability to use intellectual property owned by a third party, that it has certain rights to use pursuant to a number of license agreements. So from the beginning of the negotiation, we, the landlord, have been asking to see those license agreements, but weren't forthcoming until, the lease was pretty much done. And as it turns out, first of all, those license agreements don't run to the tenant. They run to an affiliate of the tenant. So there has to be an assignment or some kind of a sub-license agreement. And also, they don't contemplate this particular lease situation. The type of premises is not permitted in the license agreement. The duration of the term of the license rights doesn't extend through the initial term of the lease, on and on from that perspective.
Wow. And that doesn't seem like an easy thing to fix, right? Because you have this whole other entity who's, I guess, offering these licensing rights, correct? And then
That's
now they're involved, and this is almost a secondary negotiation before you can even move forward.
correct.
Yeah, that sounds
There are
very
certain ways around it, which I'm
okay.
not at liberty to go into right now.
Yeah.
The other curveball in this particular deal is that the tenant needed to raise a significant amount of money to build out the space. It's a large space, and operate for the first year until they get their revenue generation in sync with the rent they have to pay. And the changing interest rate environment has had a significant effect on their fundraising.
Okay.
So we've had to rethink time periods for delivery of a very significant security deposit, for delivering proof that they have legally binding requirements to deliver the money that they'll need for build out and operations. And these situations have been evolving and changing over the course of the negotiation. There was probably no way to get ahead of that.
Right. Just another fun byproduct of the financial markets we're in, it sounds like.
Yes.
And that goes back to your adaptability, right? And flexibility, that is a hurdle in the deal that was unfortunately somewhat unavoidable, it sounds like, but now must be addressed. Goes back to your first point.
Correct.
Mm.
Correct.
Never dull, right?
No, it's fascinating, I think, anyway.
Are there any myths or misconceptions about leasing or your role as an advisor and counsel in the business line? Anything that comes up that you just wish people knew was not really the case?
I think the one that most frequently I encounter, not in my personal transactions, but just talking to people very generally, is that a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on the leasing process, brokers and consultants, landlords, tenants, leasing teams, they sometimes unfairly characterize the attorneys as trying to make a mountain out of a molehill, whether it be because, we just tend to worry a lot because we have to be worried a lot, or because we, somehow inappropriately want to, charge for billable hours more than what the deal would otherwise take. And I really don't think that that's the case in most instances when you hire someone who really knows what they're doing. For me, I live and die with a sense of urgency because time kills deals. So the last thing I want to do is hold up a transaction for, silly reasons or just so I can bill my client more, because what kind of repeat business am I going to get if I do that? So it just doesn't make any sense. You don't develop a reputation as being a terrific leasing attorney with that sort of mindset. So I guess I wish there was a better characterization of that.
Well, that goes back to your brand and your, I guess, reputation in the industry, which obviously you've built a fantastic one and approached the business, I think, the way that all brokers and landlords wish attorneys would. So it speaks a lot for the way you run your practice.
Well, thanks, Karly. I take that very, very seriously, which, as I see it, is a balancing act on two intersecting axes of conflict. You have the urgency mandate on one hand, time kills deals, and then you have precision insurance, which means you need to get it right. You need to have an internally consistent document where you accurately reflect the business terms and adequately protect your client. Those are at conflict through the whole process. The other axis of conflict is the desire to get it all, to go for the jugular, and the need to compromise. Those are also at conflict. So what true, experts in the leasing process do as they move along these axes of conflict from the LOI to a signed lease is they manage those conflicts in a way that they can get the deal done in a practical way and still protect their client. I don't think most people have taken it apart and actually kind of see it that way. And there are probably other ways to see it, but I mean, that's what I've done in deconstructing it to put it back together again and make it more efficient.
What a realistic way to look at the deal process. And I think that, again, just shows the deal maker inside you, right? And the focus to protect your client, but also get the job done, which is the ultimate goal. So that's great.
Which is what they want.
Right. That's what the client wants for sure. And the brokers too, I might add. Yes. So, yeah, that's really a great way to look at it. Thank you for breaking it down. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you sharing your insights into retail leasing from the opinion of counsel. It's such a unique perspective, and we haven't had anyone on the show to kind of look at the transaction from the leasing perspective in this way. So very much appreciate your insights and things for everyone to watch as they try to get deals done as efficiently as possible in this crazy 2024 market that we're in. So Ellen, thank you for being part of the show.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun, Karly.
For everyone listening, that was CBRE Fast 5 Secret Sauce. We're so happy you could tune in, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Have a great day, everyone.